side to side. Now, without further ado, and to introduce David, most importantly, I hand over to Joe. So good evening, Joe.
Good evening, and I seem to have lost my screen, but hopefully you can see and hear me.
Crystal clear.
Not quite sure why it's disappeared, but anyway. So it is my very great pleasure to be welcoming David Guimaraens tonight. The last few tastings, wine society tastings that I've been involved in, have been absolutely steeped in history, and this is another of those. So David is responsible for the great port houses of Taylor, Fonseca and Croft, and the many different wines that they produce across their portfolio. And he's going to talk to us about those houses. He's going to talk about different styles of port. Hopefully he'll give us some inside info on what the 2020 harvest has been like. And so I'm really looking forward to this chat and to tasting a couple of wines with him. I've got the 10-year-old Tornie in my glass. And really, David has been part of the story of the Fladgate partnership for many, many years. He's the son of a famous father, Bruce Guimaraens, who was a very much larger than life character with a great sense of humor. And I remember my colleague Mark,
Yes.
who bought port at the Wine Society for many, many years, told me that when he first went to visit Bruce in the Douro Valley, Bruce told him, "Welcome to Pinhal. It's a one-horse town and the town has left." Sorry, the horse has left. It's totally different now. And actually one of the things that your organization, David, is involved in is tourism in a very big way. And, you know, all the more reason to go to Porto and the Douro. That said, your focus is on the wines, and that's why we're here. So David, over to you. Please take it away.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. It's as Joe said, I'm a winemaker who's grown up in a port family, and it is a huge privilege being a winemaker, and more specifically a port maker. And so being on an occasion like this, in these times, being able to share my passion, which is the ports that I make, it's a privilege for me as well. And it's the way to keep in contact with the people for which I love making my ports for. And so today I will, before we get into the tasting, I'm going to take you a bit into the world of port and this magical world of port that we have here. And yes, both Anna and Joe have talked a bit about what you can see when you come here to Portugal. You see many, many things. The Douro Valley is one of the oldest wine regions in the world, and it's extremely beautiful. And up until recently, it was really very closed and inaccessible. That has opened up, and it's a great place to visit. And likewise, the city of Porto, where traditionally the port merchants were based, and very much still are today, where the port lodges are. Porto is a beautiful city with a lot of character and charm. And the Portuguese people are some of the nicest people in the world, and you get all that when you come to visit. But so myself, I was saying, I'm actually sixth generation in the family making port, and my father Bruce, he was an extraordinary larger than life character, and I followed his footsteps in the port trade, having grown up in it. But it was when my father gave me a one-way ticket to Australia, having not done very well at boarding school in Abingdon. I finally, after having been there and doing a harvest at a winery that he gave me the contacts of, that I realized that it was winemaking, the career that I wanted to follow. And I came back home in 1990, and I've had an extraordinary 30 years in the port trade, in a region and a business which 30 years ago was so traditional through our way of working, and we've had to reinvent ourselves but never losing sight on what the empirical and the tradition has to give us. So let me go into then the presentation, and let me make sure it comes across well. Excellent. I hope you can all see the presentation. And
oh, it's perfect, David.
Perfect.
It looks great.
Thank you, Anna. Well, so yes, so we all know where Portugal is, but that's recent, because I remember when I went to Australia 30 odd years ago, people said, Portugal, is that part of Spain? We all know where it is. And the port trade and the Douro Valley in the north of Portugal, the valley itself is in the eastern part, and the characteristics of the Douro Valley very much of an inland continental climate, which is separated from the coastal climate of the city of Porto, from this mountain range which we have to cross to get there. And it is the characteristics of the growing conditions of the Douro Valley which very much are responsible for the styles of our port that we produce. But let me go into a bit of the different aspects behind a winemaker's life and the making of port, because when we talk about port, sometimes people ask, well, you know, is it a world of wine? Is it the world of spirit? What is it? Well, it is very much the world of wine, but it does share part of the world of spirit, in that there are four distinct skills that you require to be a port maker. Naturally, your viticulture, the vineyards that you cultivate, that is a skill which you share very much with any normal wine to be made, but specific to the characteristics of our growing region. Then the winemaking phase, which is transforming your grapes from these vineyards of the Douro Valley into a young port. It shares part in common with if you're making a normal wine, but there are specifics to it which make the method of winemaking very distinctive to port. And I'll come over that a bit later on. Then where we do differ to as a winemaker to making still wines is the art of distillation. That's because port, as a fortified wine, we use neutral grape spirit to fortify. And so as a port maker, we need to understand the aspects of distillation and the spirit that we're using. And finally, in port making, the art of the blender is also a very, very important role of our work. Now, blending takes different forms in the wine world. And when we're talking about table wine, most of your blending is done in the first 2 years of the age of the wine when it goes to bottle. And with port, we do have that aspect with vintage port, but it is in our aged Tornies, the ports that we age in wood for many years, that the art of the blender really comes to. And again, we will be revisiting that when we come to tasting the different styles. So as a winemaker, you need to grow your grapes. You take your grapes and you crush them to go into your fermenter. In your fermentation tank, you're there to extract all of your color, your tannin, your flavor. Then what makes port different to a normal still wine is that if you were making from a batch of red grapes to making a red wine, all of your sugar in your grape will be fermented to be transformed into alcohol, and the final table wine will have no residual sugar. Where port is different is that because port is sweet, the sweetness in your glass of port, your bottled port, is the natural sugar from the grape. And it is by adding your neutral grape spirit halfway through the fermentation that you will kill the yeast, and you will keep the sugar from the grape in your final port. And the spirit then takes your port up to 20% alcohol. And then the final phase is then your aging. So to put this into perspective, for every 450 liters of grape must, your grape juice, we add 100 liters of this neutral wine spirit distilled from wine at 77% alcohol to finish with your, what we call our pipe of port. A measure of a pipe of port is 550 liters, which has 20% alcohol by volume and 95 grams of sugar on average. So I was talking earlier about the Douro Valley, and focusing now on our viticulture. The Douro Valley is a region of mountain viticulture in a very hot climate. And the port trade has been going for over 300 years in a region which has had a very traditional viticulture, where you can see here the images of these dry stone wall terraces which support the earth on which the vineyards were planted. This is what makes the Douro Valley an extraordinarily beautiful region to visit as well. And whereas today we still have a number of these emblematic old terraced vineyards, from the 1970s forward, it was no longer possible to build these dry stone wall terraces. We needed to simplify viticulture. And so we have vineyards today which are more mechanizable, and where we build the terraces into the side of the hills, but we don't any longer have the dry stone walls. And that in itself has been a challenge in our viticulture. But here we can see this photo of terraced vineyards at Fonseca Sant Antonio Vineyard, Quinta, where you can see the grass cover in the spring, where we practice very much sustainable and organic viticulture, because the challenge becomes when you don't have your dry stone walls holding the earth, it's actually controlling your soil, and it also becomes a live surface. But viticulture is a theme in itself, which would do for a whole 2-hour seminar. The grape varieties that we use to make port, and for the red grape varieties, are all local indigenous, or mainly local indigenous grape varieties, which adapt very well to these very high temperatures, the very arid conditions, which produce grapes which have a lot of color. We do have a couple of grape varieties which have come from outside of the region. And we see down at the bottom, Alicante Boucher, in fact, was brought from France just after phylloxera by a distinguished merchant called Archibald to plant in the region. Alicante Boucher has got color in its juice, and it was used to add color. We see that in a residual quantity in the region. Our grape variety Tinta Roriz is the same grape variety as Tempranillo in Rioja. And but all the other varieties we only know within Portugal. And the traditional vineyards that I was talking about, the old vineyards, had more than 10 grape varieties planted randomly within a single block. Nowadays, we have made a selection of these grape varieties, and we plant them individually, and we plant them according to the location within the region, the location within an estate, and the desire of the winemaker. But then when it comes to the fermentation, we co-ferment them, we mix them together, because these grape varieties complement themselves. Some varieties will give a lot of color, some will give a lot of tannin, some will give a lot of sugar, some will give acidity, some will give flavor. So we bring them together in the way that we feel they suit best. And so that's when you talk about port, any style of port, you won't hear anybody talking about a single grape variety, because that is not something that we are interested in. The sum of several grape varieties will always make a better port than the single best grape variety on its own. The other aspect of the Douro Valley is that we don't irrigate our vineyards. And that is something that I'm extremely proud of. You know, for 300 years, we have been growing vineyards of grapes without irrigation. And at a time where we know water is a scarce resource, that for port is, and for us, is very much a key aspect. So then moving across into the winemaking, and here's this wonderful shot of what is a traditional winery where when I finished boarding school at the age of 18 and came back to do a harvest before my father, Bruce, gave me my one-way ticket to Australia, most port was made in traditional wineries where this crowd of people who during the day will pick the grapes in the vineyard, and in the evening they'll go and tread these granite lagars, which it's a very primitive method. However, when I was explaining at the beginning that port as a fortified wine, where we stop the fermentation halfway through to retain the sugar, what happens is that we have a very short period of time in which to extract all of the color, which is so important for your port to have its ability to age. And so this foot treading is very effective in extracting all of your color and your tannin from your skins. So you can see from this lagar how much color is there. And it's also a very simple method that where if you obey your empirical rules, you will make a very good port without needing the interference of the winemaker. So myself as a winemaker, my skill is understanding the grapes I work with. I actually want my fermentation itself to be fairly simple. This traditional method works very well. However, nowadays, the shortage of labor, the cost of labor, it is no longer possible to foot tread across all of the port that we make. So one of my big challenges when I came back home in 1990, which we were going through the transformation that our traditional foot treading is by far our best method to make port. We were already going through the first phases of having to look for alternative technology, modern technology for winemaking. And the fact is, the technology that came from table wine did not work for port, because when you're making, for example, a red wine, because you don't have to stop your fermentation, you can keep your juice on the skins for much longer. And so the technology was not there. So one of the first things I did when I came back from Australia, and I put my new world thinking hat, was to design a fermentation tank to replicate the action of the foot treading. So in the picture here, you can see the fermenters, which I designed with my colleagues in the wineries, which is, you can see a whole series of mechanical plungers which simulate the act of your treading. And that has been very important to ensure that the quality of port is very high across all the port that we make. Nowadays, up until 2019, all of the grapes from our own vineyards, we still foot tread in traditional wineries. However, the majority of port that we make comes from grapes from our grape farmers, and those grapes we bring into our modern wineries where we have these modern fermenters. The reason to continue with the foot treading is that it is a method which is so well fine-tuned has got a very distinct character. And we continue foot treading to make vintage port. And all of our vintage ports are still foot trodden. And where I said to 2019 and later during the tasting, I'll come back to the characteristics of the 2020 harvest, but because of this very complicated life we're going through at the moment, the 2020 harvest, it was not possible to foot tread. It would be irresponsible to put people in a granite lagar side by side. And so the 2020 harvest was the first harvest in our history that we did not foot tread because of the reasons, obvious reasons. So let's talk about, just before we get into the tasting, about the different styles of port. And the port trade has this unique situation where the Douro Valley is where we have the vineyards, where we make the young ports, but the aging is in the port lodges in Vila Nova de Gaia, opposite the city of Porto. And that happens because the merchants, when they set up their business 3 centuries ago, set up the lodges alongside the river in Vila Nova de Gaia. And that's because to get to the Douro Valley, it used to take, it used to be a whole day's journey. It was very inaccessible. And that's how the business developed. And the aging is mainly done in Vila Nova de Gaia, where we have the lodges. And so when we think about port, and probably this is one of the key aspects of an opportunity to do a tasting with you today, is you think about port as a fortified wine, as a category, but within port, we do have 4 distinct styles. And these different styles are dictated by the different form of aging. And that is with the exception of white port, where your white port naturally comes from white grapes. And I saw right at the beginning, somebody was starting the session with a glass of white port with them. You'll have to finish that to go on to the next styles. So white ports from white grapes, it represents about 10% of all port that is made. Within white port, you have dry white port and sweet white port. Within the red ports, we will have the tawny ports, which will be the first port we'll be tasting. And the tawny port is aged in oak casks, where a young fruity port, as it ages, will become tawny in color. It starts getting your dried fruit characters. What I call the full-bodied ports are your ruby ports. So your younger rubies, your reserve ports, your late bottle vintage, your LBV ports. These are ports which will age in large oak vats so they hold on to their fruit. Fruit is your main character. And finally, most important, your vintage ports. Vintage ports, which is your selection of your best ports from a very good year, which will be bottled after 2 years in wood, and then will age in the bottle for many, many years. So these are the 4 distinct styles of port. Today, we will be tasting 2 of them, the Tornies and the vintage. So just before we enter the tasting, then we start tasting with the 10-year-old. Let me go back to the tawny port as a style. As I was saying, the tawny ports age in small oak barrels. For us, these are small. They're 500, 600 liter oak barrels. And they are old seasoned barrels because, as contrary to table wine, which will use a barrique to get your vanilla oak flavor, in port, we age them in wood to have your contact with oxygen, and we don't want any of your oak flavor. These barrels that you can see in front of you, some of them are 70, 80, 100 years old, and we reuse them. We have a team of coopers who take care of them. And these ports, as they age, they will be racked. You can see the picture of my lodge man racking the port out of the barrel to take it off its sediment. And that is done every year to also help with the aging. So, Joe, do you want to join us?
I would love to join you. Thank you. And there've been some really good questions coming through already. very much on the subjects that you've been touching on, which is fantastic. And that was a really nice, clear summary of the different styles. Thank you. There was a question about white port, different grapes. You talked about white grapes, so that's fine. There was a question about the different styles and how long how you handle those wines. Once they're open, how do you keep those wines? Can you keep them for similar length of time? Maybe worth quickly touching on that.
Okay, beautiful, perfect. Well, does everybody have a glass of the Wine Society 10-year-old in front of you? A couple of points before we get into the handling of them. One of them is, if we're all here because we enjoy wine, half of the pleasure of wine is in the smelling and the aromas. So I recommend using a good wine glass, a white wine glass, to get enjoyment out of all of your port that you drink. Then, in terms of how do we handle the port, in terms of drinking it, aging it, when we're talking about tawny ports, as you can see here, the tawny ports have aged in contact with oxygen, and this tawny color that they have, this nutty aroma, comes from this oxidative aging. And that means that they will be bottled when we feel they are ready to be drunk. So this 10-year-old tawny, we will bottle it to be ready for drinking and have it always available. This is where the skill of the blender comes in, because the skill of the blender is to create it very consistent in style. As a 10-year-old, it has an average age of 10 years, because you're eliminating the character of the year by cross-blending years so that it is always the same. But in terms of drinkability and how to serve it, because and the 10-year-old will have a stopper cork. The stopper cork, when you have a port with a stopper cork, what we are saying is this is a port which is ready for drinking. It won't benefit from any further aging, but because it, as a fortified wine, as a port that's aged in wood, it is very stable. So you can help yourself to a glass of port, and if you can resist not going back for more, you can put the cork back on, and tomorrow or the day after, go for another glass. So the tawny ports will stay fresh easily, and exactly the same characteristics as when you open it for 3, 4, or 5 weeks. Because they've been in contact with oxygen for so many years, what is a month open in the bottle? And so, Joe, I hope that answers the question of the serving.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the beauties of this as a style of port. And the same, I guess, would go for some of the more longer aged white ports as well, that you can actually keep them once they've been opened. They do keep that freshness. Yeah, sure. Don't put it next to the cooker, but on the other hand, delicious. And mine was lightly chilled. I guess in the summer you would have it maybe a bit more chilled, particularly at this level, at the 10-year-old level. But at this time of year, just cool is delicious.
This time of the year, cellar temperature works perfectly. Cellar temperature, 15, 16 degrees. And then when it comes to the table, it will warm up and be served at 17, 18, 19. And why do we recommend your tawny ports being served chilled? A tawny port, as it ages in wood, we lose 2% of evaporation, so they concentrate. Your fruitiness gets transformed into these nutty, dried fruit, walnut aromas, and that is the beauty of it. The tannins of a young port, where tannin is rich and firm, they drop out and they soften. So what happens is when you chill it, you subdue any of the spirit aromas, particularly in the warmer months when it heats up, your spiritness starts coming out. So you subdue it, but the intensity of your nuttiness overcomes the cooler temperatures. And that makes a chilled tawny so refreshing. And I normally call it a wonderful lubricant of the conversation, because the smoothness of the Tornies is what makes them so approachable and easy to drink. Mm-hmm. The softness. And that's where the Tawny ports, and Joe, you talked about the combination. Anna, you talked about our custard tarts, the pastel de nata. A Tawny port, any egg-based dessert is, wish I could have one now too. Any egg-based dessert is a perfect combination with your Tawny, because they're soft, and that is a very good combination. So yes, the temperatures.
We could let you move on, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So the presentation disappeared for you.
We just removed it for now, sorry, David, just so people were hoping to see your face. So if you do want to move on, though, you're welcome to restart it.
Right, okay, so I'll put it back on. Right, so now we're going to, here we are, vintage port. Now, so we have a wonderful single Quinta vintage port from Quinta da Rueda from Croft. So what is vintage port? Well, to me, within port, the two most distinct families are the tawny ports and the vintage port. The tawny ports are easy. I call them sometimes the no-brainers because they're so approachable. A 10-year-old blended tawny, you just serve it when you have an occasion, just want to drink about something, you don't really want to think about it. It is nutty, it's easy. And a tawny port, because as we age, we're cross-blending different years, you have that consistency of style. Then a vintage port is all about selecting the best ports that we produce from any given year. And if we feel that certain ports that we make are of exceptional quality, we will bottle as a vintage port. A vintage port will be selected in the first tastings after the harvest as the components which need to have a lot of quality of fruit, a lot of intensity of tannin, a lot of structure, and all in perfect harmony, which we will then set those ports aside. And after the second winter has passed, we will then, in the tasting room, we will decide whether they are good enough to be bottled as a vintage. We will put together a blend which represents the house and then bottle it after 2 years in wood. Once you bottle your vintage port, it will then start its phase of aging in the bottle. A young vintage port, recently bottled, is what I call the perfect ruby port. It is a massive fruit intensity. You can taste the grape, will have a lot of tannin. And as it ages in the bottle, it will then start developing the beautiful bottle maturity characters, that marzipan, that spicy creaminess, which we love in a vintage port. And in this photo here, you can see the photo of one of our vintage cellars where the vintage ports are aged. Now, which represents aging in the bottle. But when we think about vintage port, this is also where we talk about a house style. And when when I say that the selection of a vintage, a bottle of vintage port is a time capsule, it's because in every bottle of vintage, you will capture the character of the year that it comes from and the character of the vineyards that it comes from. And on this picture that I put up, you can see basically what is a map of the Douro Valley. And the Douro Valley travels from west to east along the Douro River, Spanish frontier. And being a region of mountain viticulture, this is where this wonderful French word terroir really comes to itself. And where your quinta is within the valley will give you very distinct styles of port that are produced. And so this is where we talk about house style. That style of the house of a vintage port will be a reflection of the vineyards where it comes from. So for Croft, the Quinta da Rueda, which I'm not sure whether the arrow is coming out on your screens, but Quinta da Rueda as a property is this magnificent property alongside the village of Pinhão in the center of the Douro. And this property is so distinct in its character that the style of a Croft vintage will be the style of the Rueda Quinta. In contrast, for Taylor's has one of its quintas, Quinta de Vargelas, its flagship quinta further east, and two of its quintas in the Pinhão Valley, Quinta Terra Feita and Junco, in the valley alongside Pinhão. And it is the character of ports coming from these three estates will give the distinct style of Taylor's. For Fonseca, we have two quintas also in the Pinhão Valley, Quinta do Cruzeiro and Santo Antonio. Most of these quintas have been the backbone to Fonseca vintage, going back to the end of the 19th century, and also Quinta de Penascal in the Tavra Valley. And it is those three quintas which will represent the style of Fonseca. But tonight we have Quinta da Rueda, and this is the vintage that we are tasting now. Okay, you can see me again. Joe, the vintage port that we are tasting, the 2012 single quinta.
Yes, I don't have it, so I'm glad you do. but okay. I think I love the way you described that really quick summary of the different quintas that contribute to the different houses, and showing those on the map was really helpful, because I think something that you said to me at some stage was the contrast in this part of the world, in the Douro Valley, where the very top wines are the blended wines, are the classic declared vintages, the Taylor's, the Fonseca declared vintages. And actually, yes, this wine, the single quinta wine, is the step down. And they're a much more approachable style of vintage port. It's still a true vintage port. But I love the fact that there's such a great way into port. If you are not yet familiar with the vintage ports, it's an easier step in because the wines are more affordable. They mature a little bit earlier. And actually, one of the lovely things about Rueda as well is that it's literally on just outside Pinhão. So if you do go to the Douro, you can go and visit very easily. You're very well geared up there for visitors, aren't you? So yeah, win-win.
We've got a magnificent visitor centre, Quinta da Rueda, and it's the visitor centre very much focused on the visit of the vineyards, which I think it makes it special. But yes, Joe, and thank you for focusing on that point, because I thought I'd call you back in to become live again and continue talking about vintage port. And for those of you who have it in front of you, which I do, we can taste them at the same time. But when I was talking about the the tawny ports using your stopper cork, which you put in and out, and you can keep serving over days or weeks of tawny port. The vintage port has got a driven cork. And here again, this is where what we are saying is that a bottle of vintage port will have the capacity to open a vintage port. You need to decant it, because a vintage port will be, which will be bottled by gravity with no filtration at all. In fact, this evening we're finishing bottling the 2018 Guimaraens vintage, which is out of this world. I said earlier, I think it's my best Guimaraens vintage in my career. But a vintage port, then, you will need to decant it, because as it ages in the bottle, it will throw the sediment. So you need to decant, and I have a decanter with me here, and I'm not going to do the whole bottle, but it's a very easy and simple process, decanting your vintage and leaving off your sediment. But you focused a very important point, is distinguishing between a classic vintage port and a single quinta vintage port. And this, if we go back in the history of port, and not too much because we won't have time for it, but the port trade is made up of these merchants who established themselves in the lodges in Gaia and went to the Douro to buy the young ports from the local farmers. Nowadays, we are farmers ourselves, we make them ourselves, but go back in the early days of the trade, the vintage port would be a blend which represented a house. So the Fonseca vintage, my ancestors would buy from Cruzeiro, from Sant Antonio, from several properties, and they would make up the Fonseca vintage. And the vintage port would only be declared in the years that we felt that the port combined all of this quality of fruit and tannin, but also a lot of structure, which then had the ability to age for a lifetime in the bottle. And yes, you're right. A classic vintage, for one, it's only released occasionally, because not every year will give you those ports of the intensity. And because they're a blend of different quintas, they will represent the house style. And that is the way that the consumer, particularly in the UK, which is the traditional vintage port market, used to know vintage port. About 30 or 40 years ago, as the consumer enjoyed vintage port so much, we started bottling a vintage port just from the single estates on their own. Example here from Quinta da Rueda, or from Vargelas for Taylor, or from Penascal for Fonseca, in years that we didn't quite feel they had the structure and dimension to be a classic, but they still have to have all of the quality to be a vintage port. And as you said, Joe, that's what makes a single quinta vintage port like this Quinta da Rueda more approachable, because it's not going to age for the same 70 or 80 or 90 years as a classic, but it's still going to age for 40 or 50 or 60 years. What happens is that it will start developing quicker. That makes it approachable quicker. And here goes it. The biggest benefit for the consumer is that we release them at less than half the price of a classic. And so, as you said, a single quinta vintage port is an exceptional vintage port. It's going to age quicker, but it's great value for money. And so that will give you different occasions to drink, to open a bottle of vintage. Because I always say with vintage port is about the occasion where you want to discover the wine that you're drinking. You want to share a wine with a friend or two or three who enjoy wine. You want to discover the year. You want to discover the house or the vineyard. And that's what vintage port is all about.
And David, this young wine, I mean, the wines now are produced in such a way that this is, even as a young wine, it's approachable now. Yes, it'll certainly develop more complexity in bottle. I mean that's and again that's another difference between this and the tawny ports. This wine will continue, if it's stored correctly, it will continue to develop in bottle. It'll take on more complexity.
Very much so.
And yet they're very approachable and pleasurable drinks when they're young too. So,
well, vintage port, as I was saying earlier, a young vintage port is what I call a perfect ruby port. And there's nothing wrong with opening vintage port just after bottling it, 2-3 years after bottling. But what you will get is a perfect ruby port. So know what to expect. Then when your port starts getting its bottle development, and here we have this Huerta 2012, it's got 8 years, it's 8 years old, 6 years in the bottle. It's now starting to develop its first spiciness. And that is a really exciting phase because it's still got a lot of young berry fruit, but you now get the spiciness. And you're saying nowadays, vintage port is approachable younger because I'll put one last plug in. One of the good things about being part of the EEC is that in 1991, we managed to finish with the monopoly of the supply of the spirit from the state. So we're now, as port producers, allowed to source our own spirits directly from the distillers. And nowadays, as a result, we have much finer spirits, which means your vintage port is much more attractive when it's young and when it's going through this youthful phase to go through. That's the key point.
And actually that I think will answer one of the questions that's already come up, but we should, so that we don't run out of time, we really should move on to the Colheita port.
And that's always a danger with talking with me. I go on a bit.
No, it's great. I love listening to you.
I'm gonna put my presentation up. You won't see much other than the pretty photo, but that's worth it. Where have I put the photograph in the wrong place? Is it hidden by your pictures? So we have the bottle here of this single harvest Toddy port from 1970. And this is something we have been doing now for almost 8 years now, in that we are, when I was talking about the 10-year-old Tornie, within the world of Tawny ports, we have the blended Tornies. So a 10-year-old Tornie like this delicious Wine Society 10-year-old, or a 20-year-old from Taylor's, which is an average age of 20 years. This is where the blender will use his skill of blending to create your very consistent style. And your Taylor 20-year-old will be the same today as it was 5 years ago, and will be the same in 5 years' time. It is safe. It's what I call the no-brainer. You just go for it because you know it, you like it. However, within this wonderful world of Tawny ports, where the aging is our responsibility as the port houses, we also have what are also known as colheita. Colheita is the Portuguese word for vintage. And by tradition, the British houses would express the year as a vintage port. The Portuguese houses would express the year as a colheita, single harvest Tawny port. As British houses have in recent years actually taken from our magnificent portfolio of stocks and started bottling single harvest colheita Tawny ports. And in the case of Taylor's, we've been releasing at 50 years of age a single harvest port from 50 years ago, which is the 1970. And what you will get with a single harvest Tawny port is that the year will mark it. So this 1970 will be very different in profile to the 69 or the 68. The 1970 was a particularly hot year. The 1970 vintage ports reflect that. And in this 1970 single harvest, for one, it is wonderfully old. Because it's been aging for 50 years in wood, it is concentrated and concentrated and concentrated. To get to this one bottle, we have evaporated more than an equivalent volume over these 50 years. So it is sweeter, it is richer. Then the aromas, these nutty aromas are just so much more intense, but you start getting other aromas. You get spicy aromas, you get nutmeg, you get so many different aromas. And on the palate, it is rich, it is intense, and it's got a flavor that just goes on and on. So when I was talking earlier about serve port in a wine glass, well, when you get a very old tawny port like this, when you finish drinking what's in the glass, just the aromas in it will carry on, and you can just, I usually say, you can usually sit in the corner and just keep discovering those aromas for ages after you finish your last drink.
And David, there's a comment actually come up as well, and I was thinking just the same thing. There's a tremendous colour in that wine still, which yes, I guess comes from the concentration, that natural concentration over time.
It's very interesting that a tawny port, when it's young, it is red. In its first 20 years, it will drop the red and start developing your Tornies, your browns. This 50-year-old, it's got more and more browns, but you start getting an olive tone on the edge. That olive, that greenness becomes even more intense with time. And so it goes from being dark red when it's young to becoming pale tawny. And then when it gets very old, it goes to dark olive brown. And that's just a measure of age.
And these, I don't know what the production is of these aged wines. I imagine it's pretty small, but is there still, do you still have a significant role to play here, so that there's a small number of barrels to play with and you decide on the final blend that will be released? It's not just a single cask, is it?
No, it's not a single cask. What happens, this is where the role of the blender with all tawny ports, even the single harvest, it will be very important in that as it ages, the blender can decide to have it in several casks, or it gets to a point where he might put some in a larger vat, put it together, and some in casks. Because these ports have got to be taken care of, they've got to be followed. You can't just put it in a barrel, forget about it, and 50 years later say, oh, what's this taste like? For example, in whiskey, it's much simpler. Your whiskey is very stable, and that you put it in barrel and leave it. You won't move it much over its age. Not in the case of a tawny port, and even in the case of a single harvest, the blender's got to take care of it. In the port trade, the role of the winemaker is different to the role of the blender. And in all of our port houses, we have a blender who I work with, who's separate, a Taylor blender, a Fonseca blender, a Croft blender, and they take care of their stocks over time, over the age. And this has always been, in fact, it's a beautiful story of the port trade. When my father joined the company in 1956, my great aunt Dorothy was the family member in Fonseca at the time, Dorothy Guimaraens, but the blender was Senhor Lucas, the Portuguese blender. Aunt Dorothy, she passed away quite young. My father took the reign very early on in the early 60s, but my father was still fairly inexperienced. And Senhor Lucas was, he had the history, the years of experience to work with my father. When Senhor Lucas retired, Senhor Mario joined. In fact, my father took Signor Mario to work at the age of 11 in those days, because not in the tasting room, but he took him by hand. He was the next door neighbor to where my grandparents lived, son. And he started working with my father. My father retired in 1994. And when he retired, I had been back for 4 years, but Signor Mario had been working with us since the 1960s. And together, I worked with his years of experience and me being the next generation. So Mario retired 4 years ago after 51 years working in the company. And Fernando Meireles, who started in the tasting room also young, he took the role of the Fonseca blender, and he works with me. And this is a beautiful combination in the port trade. You got the family member. I myself am a winemaker and family member, but also you have the blender. And this is very much a teamwork. There are no single heroes in the port trade. It is very much a joint effort where we all have a lot to contribute. And this is where port, as a fortified wine, this ability to age, or even in a vintage port, when you bottle a vintage port, after 2 years, you're committed to that decision. Go wrong. Our reputation is on the line. And that's why this experience, this wealth of knowledge of experience is fundamental, be it in the tawny ports, be it in the vintage.
Thank you so much, David. Really fascinating stuff. And yeah, we've got people commenting saying, what an interesting guy. So not only interesting houses, but it's been a pleasure to hear from you. I hope you don't mind, David. Could we stay on maybe a couple more minutes just to ask you a few more questions? I'm conscious Joe did put in a few questions from members throughout the presentation, but we did just cherry pick a couple of others. And I'm very conscious we have had so many this evening. So we'll handle the questions that haven't been answered after the session as well. But firstly, and this is going to be a really whistle stop quick fire question, would it be possible to just give a very, very brief description of the differences between the houses?
Mm-hmm. Well, when we talk about differences between the houses, it's very much within vintage and with Tornies, but let me focus on vintage port. And Croft is very much based on Quinta da Rueda. Quinta da Rueda is in Pinhão. It's in the central part of the Douro Valley, and it is a north-facing property. It produces ports which are extremely tropical fruits, very exuberant, almost minty in aromas, and on the palate, they're very silky, very smooth, and that is very much Croft as a style, very exotic and very silky, very smooth.
I think David's possibly frozen there. Just whilst we get David back, Joe, if I can unmute you quickly, because we did actually have a question from a member. Could somebody possibly explain what a quinta is to those who perhaps don't know?
Absolutely. So quinta literally just means farm. So it's an individual property. And what you will find, as David illustrated from his map, where he had lines to the different quintas. So there are a number of different properties that all feed into a single brand. So a single quinta port comes from a single property, whereas a traditional vintage port will come from a blend of different properties.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And another question, Joe, that you might be able to answer. I think we'll probably run out of time for the other questions, unfortunately, but hopefully get David back at the very least to thank him and raise a glass. But we did have another question that you might be able to help with, Joe, which was around declaration. So how and when are ports declared, and possibly the difference between, for example, vintage champagne. and vintage port? Because I know that sometimes it can be a bit confusing about how they're declared.
Yeah, in some ways there are analogies with champagne in the sense that a classic vintage isn't made every year. In the Douro, it tends to be every 5 or 6 years, give or take. Some years they'll come in a row. We've recently had a run of them, but they're not necessarily every year. And it's all, David alluded to it earlier, it's all to do with the style of that vintage, of course the quality, but also the style and making sure that all the right components are there. And at the beginning of the year, they will assess the wine from 2 years previously to decide, is it or isn't it going to be a declared vintage? And one of the things that we haven't managed to touch on is the 2018 vintage, which was declared this year. And Taylors and Fonseca did declare the wines, but they chose not to release them this year because of the circumstances that we have all found ourselves in. So we're very much hoping that they will be releasing those wines next year. Yeah, hopefully we can look forward to that. Now, with a bit of luck, David might be back. I would hate if we didn't have him right at the end.
If we didn't get to thank him. I just would want to add one tiny thing, sorry, Joe, on the declaration. It's the house that declares, am I correct in thinking? So the house can choose whether they produce a vintage. It's not a group decision. There's not a sort of
no, it is totally down to each individual producer or company. Having said that, there are some years where the consensus is so great that pretty well everybody, and that would tend to be called universal declaration or a wide declaration. Some years, some people feel that even if others aren't declaring a vintage, they feel that for them it's been so good, and therefore they make it a classic vintage. So it does vary. It does mean that it's jolly complicated. And they play with us. They make us wait for the news. They make us wait for the information. So you don't always know ahead of time, but hang on in there because they come around every few years. They do come around and it's worth waiting for.
Fantastic. And for clarity, we had 18, 19 and 20, potentially 20. We wouldn't know, would we? But we hope hope on 19 as well.
19, who knows? David will be David and his colleagues will be tasting those wines after Christmas. They'll start retasting them after Christmas, and they will take a view then, is 19 a vintage that they feel that they want to declare or not? If it's not, then will there be some single quinta wines that they will release? Perhaps. So yes, all still to play for.
That's the fun of it, isn't it? I think behind the scenes, Catherine's trying to get David back online. We have had a couple of members say that they would like to stay and wait and thank him, which I think is very kind. We've had various questions on all sorts of things relevant to David. I have got another quick one, Joe, if you don't mind answering, and then I think we'll have to call a spade at some point. But we have had, we're here.
I've lost my vineyard.
No problem.
It happened.
It does. It certainly does. That's the wonders of this, the wonders and the trepidations as well. But I think probably what's best, I know that lots of members have got to get off, have food, etc. We've plenty of members saying thank you to you, David, in the chat, and I would like to second that as well. I will let Joe do a formal thank you. For any members, I would like to say, who haven't had their questions asked, we could have done a whole day with David, I have no doubt. So I apologize that we didn't get around to everything, but anything that we can answer over email, we certainly will. Yes, plenty of members saying we could listen to you for ages, David. But I'll hand over to Joe. But from a personal point of view, thank you very much for giving up your time, David.
David, that was absolutely fabulous. Thank you. I'm sorry we lost you briefly at the end there, but it was really thorough. In the time you covered a huge amount. If you don't mind, I'm sure there are lots of members who have put in questions. They'd love to get some answers if we can drop you a line and we can then send them those answers personally. So a huge thank you. You know, on these occasions, one learns so much And one of the things that I learned this evening was that we went to school in the same town.
Really?
I went to St. Helens in
St.
Aberdeen,
Helens.
obviously decades before you.
St.
So
Helens.
that was amazing. That was amazing to hear that. So fantastic. I'm lucky enough to go back regularly because my mother and sister still live there.
Really?
So,
No.
so that was an extraordinary coincidence. So David, thank you so much for giving up your evening this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure to see you. We'll look forward to seeing you either here or, if I'm lucky, see you over there soon enough. But yeah, we'll really look forward to seeing you here. Thank you for all your time and all the preparation, and also to those behind the scenes, your team and our team, because I know you and I could not have done this on our own. So cheers to you. It's been great to see you.
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed it so much. It's difficult because we have 300 years of history. There is so much that I could go into, and I love what I do, and so it's been great to be able to share this these few moments, so it's been a real pleasure. Cheers to everyone, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, David.
Take care. Bye bye, and you take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.